Welcome to the Economy of the Universe. I'm Leon Clark. In this episode, I'm going to attempt to tackle the idea of rights and the confusion that surrounds them, and put forward an understanding of rights that we can apply to everyday political thought. We so often hear about human rights. It's a phrase that is so dominant in our political discourse, and yet so seldom defined or explained. When an idea is both revered but also nebulous, it is easy for the idea to be hijacked by people with misguided or malicious motivations. Take the idea of freedom, for example. I'm sure everyone thinks their views represent freedom, from Nazis to communists to anarchists, and everyone in between. All claim to represent freedom, but freedom can't be one thing and also the opposite. Precisely because it's so poorly defined, freedom is essentially a meaningless term in our society. The same can be said for rights. All claim to be for human rights, rendering the term meaningless. Either we accept every definition of rights, in which case the idea of rights necessarily comes into opposition with itself, or we reject the word because it has become hollow and therefore ignore the idea of rights altogether. Both of these scenarios are hazardous to the perpetuation of a free society. So, as far as I can see, rights can be separated into three categories. A right can either be 1. A natural right, 2. A procedural right, or 3. Not a right. Let's examine these one by one. A natural right is an activity, active or passive, that if prevented from engaging in by force or under threat of force, you can legitimately defend with violence. For example, if someone tries to stop me from expressing my opinion under the threat of violence, I could justifiably resist in order to protect my right to speech. This applies to passive activities too, such as owning property. If someone breaks into your home, you are entitled to use force to protect yourself and your property. Natural rights are inalienable. They can't be taken away. As long as you are not violating the natural rights of others, you are free to do anything you please. Their basis lies in the idea that you are sovereign over your faculties, decisions, actions, and conscience, and others have no right to interfere except in self-defense. Procedural rights are man-made rights that balance the only interest of government, justice, with the citizen's natural right to freedom. Government's only legitimate use of force is in self-defense and defense of others, just like the individual. Government is given the power of force to prevent violations of natural rights. To balance this extraordinary power, there are procedural rights that are given to citizens to protect their natural rights from government encroachment. These include the right to vote, or the rights to trial by jury and legal representation, to ensure that the government's power to enforce justice doesn't overstep its rightful boundaries. In the Constitution, this can be seen in our right to due process, a recognition of procedural rights. Then we come to those things which are not rights. These are things which, in order to be realized, require actions which, if done by an individual, would be considered immoral and often illegal, and violate the natural rights of others. Therefore, they necessitate the power of government for their enforcement. They usually come under the guise of protection or justice, which are the domain of government. Examples include the right to protection from offensive speech, the right to protection from economic competition, the right to just wages. Satisfying these so-called rights requires force or the threat of force in violation of the natural rights of others. So what ought to be the relationship between rights and government? These rights not only predate government, they are its purpose. To quote Frederic Bastiat, "It is not because men have made laws that life, liberty, and property exist. On the contrary, it is because life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that men make laws." And to quote the Declaration of Independence, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Government power serves one just purpose, protection of natural rights, and the power given to the government is derived from the consent of the governed. Not only is it wrong for governments to violate the natural rights of individuals, it is a total betrayal of its purpose. With regard to procedural rights, things are slightly different. It may seem that because government is the source of procedural rights, they may take them away. But governments receive their power from the consent of the governed, so these rights may only be taken away by the governed themselves. Citizens, in the manner prescribed by law, may alter or abolish these procedural rights. However, any well-constituted government would create an extremely high threshold of popular support and deliberation for any weakening of procedural rights. Finally, what should be the relationship between government and those things which are mislabeled rights, but are in fact the opposite? In many respects, they are so accepted and deep-rooted in society today that it is necessary for government to accommodate them. However, it is also necessary to remember that by indulging these violations of natural rights, the government is acting in complete opposition to its duty. Just as with slavery at the founding of America, although impossible to immediately remove, such injustices should be placed in the course of their ultimate extinction. Where does democracy play its part in the relationship between rights and government? In most Western countries today, democracy is seen as an end in itself. If the people vote for a certain policy or individual, it is seen as legitimate. However, frequently, democracy produces governments and policies that are hostile to natural rights. So the question we are left with is this: should the government be ruled by the will of the people through democracy, or should government be obliged to follow certain moral principles and duties, the protection of natural rights of citizens, regardless of its popularity? It is the same question that animated the great Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas argued that slavery should be left to popular sovereignty. He had no opinion on slavery and believed the people of a state or territory should decide for themselves if they wanted slavery or not. Abraham Lincoln held that slavery was always a moral evil and should be placed in the course of its ultimate extinction. This question is even the basis of the debate of Socrates and Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Thrasymachus argues that justice is merely the interest of the stronger, that might makes right, while Socrates argued that justice is an external idea that humans have to discover and attain. This conflict between these two beliefs, the one asserting that there is no moral law, only power and the will of men, the other believing that there is a moral law to govern us, and it is the source of all justice and legitimate power. This conflict is the basis of all political debate. It has appeared again and again throughout the ages, from Moses and Pharaoh, Christ and Pilate, Socrates and Thrasymachus, the colonies in Great Britain, Lincoln and Douglas, and through the Second World War and the Cold War, and it continues today in the fundamental debate over the role of government, as it will continue through all time. So, as I often do, I will finish with a quote by Abraham Lincoln. "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." Thank you. Next episode will be about populism and elitism, and which should govern our society. If you have any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions, please email me at theeconomyoftheuniverse@gmail.com. Thanks.